Hello everyone. This chapter will focus on the skeletal system. As we go through this chapter, I would like you to focus on the following questions. 1. What are the functions of the skeletal system? 2. What is the skeletal system made up of? In other words, what are the organs and the tissues that are found in the skeletal system? 3. How does the bone grow? How does it go about repairing? And bone remodeling, what is it? Right? What are the hormones that are involved in bone growth, remodeling, and repair? What are some health conditions associated with the loss of bone? We are going to spend some time talking about osteoporosis. And finally, but not least, what are the different components in terms of the arrangement of the bones on the body? We're going to talk about the axial skeleton, the appendicular skeleton. In the axial skeleton, we are going to dive into the different segments of the axial skeleton and the different segments of the appendicular skeleton. With that said, let's make our first stop on the functions of the skeletal system. Now, the skeletal system roughly can be summarized into 5 different functions. 1 is to provide support to the body. Think about that. You are able to stand on your feet and be on an upright position. This is possible because the bones are solid enough and stiff enough to provide you the support that is needed for you to be in erected position, right? 2 is to provide protection to soft organs. Think about the cranium that is housing the brain, right? The eye sockets that are housing your eyes. Your eyes are soft, right? And the sockets are there to protect the eyes. The production of blood cells. Now, we looked at the circulatory system, and as part of the circulatory system, we looked at the blood, and we said that the blood cells originate in the red bone marrow, and that red bone marrow is found at the extremity of long bones. Please remember that. So the skeletal system is going to play a very important role in producing blood cells. Then we have the storage of minerals. The main minerals we are going to actually address are going to be the calcium and the phosphate. But these are not the only minerals that are stored in the blood, right? In the bones. You're also going to have magnesium, for instance. But let me close that parenthesis. The skeletal system is also a location where a lot of fat tissue is stored. And that fat tissue plays a very important role as insulation, right? Production of heat, but also production of energy, right? In our body. Finally, but not least, the skeletal system is essential in allowing movements as skeletal muscles are attached to the skeletal system. That is the reason why you can actually run, you can walk, you can talk, you can move your arms and legs in a way that is fantastic. For instance, when you consider a dancer making dance movements, right? You can move all these bones because of the muscle that are attached to them. All right, with that being said, let's move on to the next aspect, the anatomy of the bone. Now, when we consider long bones, the long bones are going to be made up of 2 major types of bones: the compact bone and the spongy bone. The compact bone is typically found making up the shaft of the long bones, while the spongy bone is typically found at the extremity of long bones. But let me kind of go back to specifically the compact bone. The compact bone is made up of building bone units. These bone units are called osteons. One osteon, several osteons, right? These osteons are going to have toward the very middle a part that is called the central canal. This central canal is where blood vessels and nervous tissue are going to run through. Then you are going to have that in the osteons, there are some little chambers that contain the bone cells. The little chambers are called lacunae. One lacuna, several lacunae. And the bones that are contained in these chambers are bone cells. And these bone cells are called osteocytes, right? Now, again, the compact bone is going to be very abundant in the shaft of the long bones. Then we have the spongy bone. The spongy bone is made up of plates. These plates are going to be spaced out almost like, when you look at a sponge, right? You look at a sponge, you see that the sponge is made up of areas that are filled and areas that are empty, right? And the spongy bone is going to be typically found in the extremity of long bones, right? And that spongy bone is going to contain the red bone marrow. And that very red bone marrow is the one that contains the precursors of blood cells, whether you are talking about red blood cells or white blood cells or even platelets, right? The precursors of blood cells or the formed element of the blood come from the red bone marrow. All right. So here we do have a structural organization of the bone with an osteon. This is an osteon or a bone unit, right? You're going to have the central canal right here. The central canal, it's where you're going to have your blood vessels, right? So you have your arteries, your vein, but also the nervous tissue, the nerves, right? To innervate the bones. That's why whenever you bump your bone against something, you hurt, or when you break it, you hurt, right? Because there could be a rupture of this nervous tissue. Now, so we have the osteon. That's the bone unit in the compact bone. Now, you are going to have, if we zoom in, you're going to have right in here some dark spots. These dark spots are bone cells, and these bone cells are nothing but osteocytes. These osteocytes are within a chamber. So you look at the chamber, this is the chamber right here, right? That chamber is called a lacuna. So one lacuna, several lacunae, right? We have the osteocyte right in here. And the osteocyte is the cell that make up the bone. It makes the bone, it remodel the bone. We are going to address that now. You have different kind of bone cells based on what they do. We're going to call them differently, right? But I want you to remember that. Now, the bone develops out of cartilage, and specifically hyaline cartilage. So here we have a micrograph of hyaline cartilage, and if you remember what we said about the cartilage tissue, we said that it was a connective tissue, right? That is solid but flexible, and that we do have a matrix, right? That contains some little chambers. In these chambers, you're going to have some cells that are called chondrocytes. The chondrocytes are cartilage cells, right? This hyaline cartilage is going to be replaced progressively by the bone. This is what we call ossification. 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 All right? Ossification, let's see. It's the bone formation. Now, in the skeletal system, you are going to have cartilage. You're going to have cartilage in some places. Now, the cartilage, it's flexible. It is a connective tissue. It's a specialized connective tissue, right? And the matrix of the cartilage, it's actually a bunch of collagen fibers and elastic fibers that are trapped in with carbohydrates and some salt. But this concentration of salt is not as much as in the blood. I want you to remember the cartilage, because from the cartilage you are going to have the formation of the bones. Now, that cartilage falls into three types of cartilages. We have the hyaline cartilage that is found at the extremity of long bones, right? It is also found in the nose and on the chest area, right? You have some hyaline cartilage in the chest area. We are going to see this when we look at basically the organization of the skeletal system. Other places where you find the hyaline cartilage, the larynx and the trachea or the windpipe. Then we're going to have the fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage, it's actually a type of cartilage that is found between the vertebrae, right? Forming discs in the vertebrae, right? So these discs between the vertebrae allows to basically serve as cushion, right? For instance, when you jump and you land, right, your vertebrae can bang against each other. But to avoid that, you have these discs, right, that are made up of fibrocartilage. They are very thick and very strong. You also find fibrocartilage in the knees and also in the pelvic area, right? In the pubic area, right? The two pubic bones are connected together through some fibrocartilage. The fibrocartilage is much stronger than the hyaline cartilage. Then we have the elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is found, for instance, in the ears, right? The extremity of ears, well, not very much the extremity of the ears, but throughout the ear, the epiglottis in your throat, okay? The elastic cartilage is characterized by the fact that it is very flexible. It contains more elastic fibers than collagens. That's why they are flexible. So now, what are the bones of the skeleton? Now we are going to dive into the different components of the skeleton. So you are going to have two parts of the skeleton. You're going to have the axial skeleton, that is this, And you're going to have the appendicular skeleton. So anything that is attached to the axis, right? That's the appendicular skeleton. Now, let's first of all spend some time on the axial skeleton. The axial skeleton is going to be made up of the skull, right? Right here. And the skull is going to be made up of the frontal bone, the zygomatic bone, the maxillary bones, and the mandible. We are going to address some details in a minute, okay? Now, this is actually the front side, but when we go in the back, we are going to see more, right? We're going to see, for instance, right here, the occipital bone, right? But we're also going to see the parietal bone, right? Now, looking at now the other part of the actual skeleton, we are going to have the vertebral column. The vertebral column is itself going to be divided into some subparts, right? Now, the vertebral column, to the vertebral column is going to be attached a number of bones, including the ribs. But in addition to the ribs, you're going to have the sternum and some hyaline cartilage right here, okay? The costal cartilage, you have the ribs, you have the sternum. All together, that makes up the rib cage, right? So the actual skeleton is made up of the skull, the rib cage, and the vertebral column, right? Oh, actually, I forgot to mention something. The sacrum and the coccyx. These are also parts of the actual skeleton. Now, how about the appendicular skeleton? How about the appendicular skeleton? The appendicular skeleton, right? It's going to have this, and that it's actually part of what we call the pectoral girdle. The pectoral girdle is going to have the clavicle, the scapula, right? The scapula right here, the clavicle right here, right? Then the lower limbs, you're going to have the humerus right here, the humerus, and then you're going to have the ulna right here and the radius, okay? The ulna and the radius. Then you have the hand. In the hand, you're going to have the carpals, the metacarpals that is in the middle, and the phalanges, right? Now, how about the lower limbs? Well, actually, before we address the lower limbs, I have to talk about the pelvic girdle. The pelvic girdle is made up of the hip bone. You have two hip bones, right? And now, to the hip bones are attached the lower limbs. And this is now where we're going to look at the femur, the longest bone in your body. To the femur, you are going to have attached the tibia, the fibula, right here, and the bones of the foot. In the foot, you are going to have the tarsals, just like the hand that have metacarpals, you're going to have metatarsals. So you're going to have metatarsals, and you're going to have the phalanges, right? Now, this was a little bit fast in telling you about all the bones in the body. But we are going to split this skeleton into small parts, and we are going to go part by part. Now, the skull It is made up of the cranium and the facial bones. Now, if I go back here, you are going to see right here the cranium and the facial bones. Okay? Now, underneath of the skull, you are going to have the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone, it's a particular bone in the body. Particular in the sense that this is the bone that holds the tongue, that is actually not specifically attached directly to the remainder of the skeleton, but somehow it is attached, right? Then we have the vertebral column. The vertebral column is made up of bones that are called vertebrae. One vertebra, several vertebrae, right? And these vertebrae are going to have intervertebral discs in between. And then you are going to have attached to the vertebrae, right, the rib cage that is going to be made up of ribs and the sternum. And obviously, you are also going to have the intercostal ribs, right? All right, the skull. Now, between you and I'm not going to ask you to remember the different bones that make up the skull because you have a lot of them, right? I'm not going to ask you to remember the different bones that make up the skull because it's just a lot of work, okay? Now, if you are considering some more anatomy and physiology as part of your college curriculum or courses, you will have to know those. But for the sake of human biology, I'm not going to require you to know the different bones in here. All right. I was telling you about the hyoid bone, right? The hyoid bone is the bone that holds your tongue. This is the bone right here. Okay? Now, how about the vertebrae? Again, we are here diving into the actual skeleton, right? We just saw the skull. Now we are moving forward. We are diving into the vertebrae. The vertebrae, there are 33 vertebrae. These vertebrae are distributed based on their location. You're going to have the cervical vertebrae, 7 of them, make up the neck. You're going to have the thoracic vertebrae. You have 12 of them. They make up your chest. You're going to have the lumbar vertebrae. You have 5 of them. These are making up the lower back. And the sacrum. The sacrum, it's actually 5 vertebrae that are fused together, right? And then you're going to have the coccyx. The coccyx is made up of 4 fused vertebrae that are actually also called the tailbone. Okay? Now, between vertebrae, you're going to have intervertebral discs that are made up of fibrocartilage. I expect you to know this. I will test you on this. So, know that you have different type of vertebrae: cervical vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae. Then, as part of the vertebral column, you're going to have the sacrum and the coccyx. The sacrum, it's actually a bunch of vertebrae that are fused together. And the coccyx, actually, it's the tailbone. And in between the vertebrae, you're going to have intervertebral discs. Please remember that. I will bug you with that. All right. So, there is a particular detail I would like to mention here. I want you to notice how the vertebral column is actually showing some curvatures. You have a curvature right here, another one right here, another one right here, and another one right here. So that you have 4 different curvatures. You have one curvature here that we call the cervical curvature, okay? You have a cervical curvature. You have the thoracic curvature, right? The thoracic, where you're going to have the thoracic vertebrae. Then you're going to have the lumbar curvature right here. And finally, you're going to have the pelvic curvature. Now, these curvatures actually are organized in such way that you have what we call primary curvatures and you have secondary curvatures, right? The primary curvatures of your vertebral column, you're going to have two of them. You have as primary curvature the thoracic curvature. So this one is primary curvature. Another primary curvature is going to be the sacral curvature. This one is also a primary curvature. However, the cervical curvature and the lumbar curvature, these two curvatures are secondary curvatures. These secondary curvatures are developed after birth. When a baby is born, the baby is born kind of curled, right? The baby is curled because of the positioning of the baby in the womb, right? So when the baby comes out, naturally the baby is going to be curved. That's the primary curvature, right? So the baby is kind of curved like this because the spine, the vertebral column is curved like this. Now, as the baby comes out, then over time, the baby will start lifting their head up. As they lift their head up, you have this curvatures that goes from primary to secondary for lifting the head up. All right? That's the origin of the cervical curvature. And then the lumbar curvature. Now, at some point, the baby starts crawling, and then the baby starts walking. When the baby starts walking, the child has to be on their feet, right? And as they are on their feet, now all of a sudden, the weight of the body will be supported by the skeleton. The lumbar vertebrae are going to actually suck a bunch of that weight, and under the pressure of the weight, you're going to have that secondary curvature that is going to develop, forming the lumbar curvature as secondary curvature. All right? So please remember these different things. Okay? So you can also dive into, take a deeper look at this slide and notice actually the different structures you find on the vertebrae. But please remember that you have the cervical vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, the coccyx, and the sacrum, right? I want you to remember that. I want you to remember the different curvatures, right? Cervical curvature, thoracic curvature, lumbar curvature, and sacral curvature. Please remember those. All right. How about the rib cage? The rib cage obviously is going to be made up of ribs, right? The rib cage is the area where your lungs are going to be and your heart is going to be. So needless to say that the rib cage is going to protect some soft organs here. Remember that the skeletal system has as function protection, right, of soft organs. Okay, please remember that. The ribs are relatively flat bones right? They are elongated, right? You are going to have 12 pairs of ribs. These 12 pairs of ribs are organized in groups of false ribs and true ribs. The true ribs, you have 7 pairs of true ribs and 5 pairs of false ribs. Out of the false ribs, you are going to have 3 pairs that are real false ribs, and you are going to have 2 pairs that are floating false ribs. Okay? So you have 2 pairs that are floating ribs, 3 pairs that are false ribs, right? These are the true false ribs, right? And then you have 7 pairs of ribs that are true ribs. But really, when we say false ribs, what do we mean by false ribs, right? We are going to address that. The sternum. The sternum, it's actually a couple of bones that are connected together, right? The sternum is also called the breastbone, right? You have a couple of bones that are connected together there. You're going to have the manubrium, you're going to have the body, and then you're going to have the xiphoid process. But that's another story. I'm not going to bug you. Well, yeah, well, let me tell you. Okay. The manubrium right here, okay? This is the manubrium, okay? The body of the sternum, this is it. And the xiphoid process, this is it. Okay? All together it makes up the sternum. All right? Now, the ribs, you are going to notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 right here. 12 pairs, right? Because what you have on the right hand side, you also have it on the left hand side. All right? So that's 1. 2, you want to notice that the true ribs are those ribs that if I draw a line here, notice that these ribs are directly attached to the sternum. All the 7 pairs of ribs are directly attached to the sternum. Okay? Then you have ribs, while attached to the sternum, they are not directly attached to the sternum. They are attached to the sternum via, so when you consider ribs 8, 9, and 10, those ribs, so the cartilage, they are attached to the intercostal cartilage here, right here, okay? So actually, these 3 pairs are actually attached to the hyaline cartilage of the 7th rib pair, okay? So that these 3 pairs are not directly attached to the sternum, but they are indirectly attached to the sternum, right? That's why they are called false ribs, right? The floating ribs obviously are also false ribs, but they are floating ribs because they are not attached to the sternum, whether it is directly or indirectly. They are not attached to the sternum. That's why they are floating ribs. All right. So now, let's dive into the appendicular skeleton. The appendicular skeleton, the first step is going to be the pectoral girdle. So here we have the scapula and the clavicle. The clavicle, the scapula. Now, to that, you are going to have attached the upper limbs. In the upper limbs, you're going to have your arms, right? And the hand bones. Now, in the arms, you're going to have the forearm and the arm itself, right? What are the bones that make up this organ? Well, we are going to have this huge bone that is actually called the humerus. Then you're going to have on the medial side, I'm talking about the medial side, so toward the middle segment of your body, you're going to have the ulna, while toward the lateral side of your body, you are going to have the radius, right? The radius. Now going down, now you are going to go toward the hand. But before you reach the hand, you're going to have the wrist first, right? That wrist is made up of a bunch of bones that form the carpals. Carpals, a carpal mean hand, right? Metacarpals, meta, it's in the middle. This is what makes the palm of your hand, right? Metacarpals are all the bones that make up the palm of your hand. And then you have the digits, the fingers, right? The phalanges, okay, make up the digits of your hand. How about the pectoral girdle? The pectoral girdle is going to be made up of the hip bone or the coxal bone, right? The hip bone or the coxal bone. Now, the hip bone, it's a relatively complex bone. It's actually three bones that are fused together. You're going to have the ilium, the top portion. You're going to have the pubic bone, the front part, and then you're going to have the ischium, the back part or the bottom part of the bone. Now, to the pelvic girdle, you're going to have lower limbs that are going to be attached. The biggest and longest bone of the body, you're going to have the femur, all right? Underneath of that, the second biggest bone, or longest bone of the body, you're going to have the tibia, and associated with the tibia, you're going to have the fibula, right? And in the knee area, you're going to have the kneecap, right? The kneecap is called the patella, okay? The kneecap is also called the patella. Now, you're going to have, making up the ankle area, you are going to have the tarsals. You're going to have the metatarsals, a bunch of bones. Okay, oops, actually the metatarsals are right here, rather. Sorry. The metatarsals are right here. And then you're going to have the phalanges. Okay, the toes. All right. So, when someone dies, it is possible to actually determine the gender of the individual who died. It is possible to tell if the person was an infant, a baby, an adult, but there are just some other features that are not obvious. For instance, determining the ethnicity of an individual from the remaining, it's not always possible, right? Now, you can tell the age of the individual looking at the skeleton. Part of the skeleton, for instance, is going to be the teeth, right? Looking at the teeth, we can determine the age, right? Looking at the long bones, we can tell if the person was still growing or if the person was done growing, right? Just looking at the extremity of long bones, we can tell that, right? Because in the growth process, there are some tissues, specifically the hyaline cartilage, that is present at the extremity of long bones, right? And specifically where the red bone marrow is developing, right? When that cartilage, the hyaline cartilage, is completely replaced by bone, at that point the individual is not growing anymore. So we can assume that the individual was an adult when they died. Or we can also say the individual was still growing, so it was a young man or a teenager boy or girl, things like that. So we can tell based on the level of ossification if the individual is a child, a baby, or an adult. Other thing, from a dead body, we can tell if the individual was a male or a female. Specifically, we can tell if an individual was a male or a female by looking at the pelvic bone. The pelvic bone is going to have a particular presentation. In a male, that presentation is different in a female, right? The space between the pubic bones actually is going to be different between a male and a female. But let me close that parenthesis. Again, ethnicity, it's not obvious to tell. All right. So we have our bones that are connected together. We talked about the role of the skeleton in movement, right? We talked about the role of the skeleton in protecting our soft organs. But the question is, how are bones coming together to form the structures that allow protection, movement, and so on? Now, this is when we have to talk about joints. There are different kind of joints. We have what we call fibrous joints. The fibrous joints contain a lot of protein fibers. These protein fibers are bringing bones together, right? Wherever you have fibrous joints, you're going to have the bones brought together in such way that it's not always possible to allow full motion, right? So sometimes the bones are going to be kept in place by bunch of collagen fibers, right? And elastic fibers. For instance, when you consider your teeth are in place and do not move, right? The bones of your skull, for instance, the bones of the cranium, are positioned in place and do not move, right? Now, whenever two bones come together in such a way that they cannot move, right? Typically, this is going to be because the connecting point, which is a joint, it's the kind of joint that we call a suture, right? Then we have some cartilaginous joints. This is when two bones are connected together through some collagens. Think, for instance, of the intercostal collagen, right? That connects actually the sternum to the ribs, right? Also, think of the intervertebral discs, right? And think of the two pubic bones that are connected together through through fibrocartilage, right? And then we have some joints that, while bones are connected to each other via fibrous proteins, they are actually able to move freely. These are the joints that we call synovial joints. The synovial joints allow free movement, right? For instance, the hip, you can move your arm in a circulatory way, right? You can move your leg in a circulatory way, right? Because you have a type of connection that is, for instance, ball and socket type of connection, saddle connection, right? This, I'm just giving you different kind of joints here. All right. So these joints allow bunch of movement. Now, the joints that allow most of the movement are the synovial joints. Okay? When you consider this athlete, for instance, doing all this movement, it's because of the synovial joints. Without the synovial joints, forget about all these movements, right? You have some joints that are, for instance, in this particular case right here, the ball and socket joint. That's the type of joint that you are going to find making up the shoulder, right? Another type of ball and socket joint is the joint between the femur and the hip bone, right? Then you have some other joints, such as the hinge joint, right? The hinge joint, you're going to find it, for instance, in the elbow, right here, okay? So you can only extend your arm so long, right? Because of this area of the ulna. All right. So the synovial joints are going to allow a bunch of movement, including flexion, extension. Then you're going to have adduction, abduction, right? Adduction toward the middle segment, abduction away from the middle segment, right? You're going to have a supination facing up, pronation facing down, right? Circumduction, it's going to be a circular motion. Rotation, also a circular motion. Inversion and eversion. So the inversion is going to be the movement of the foot toward the middle segment of the body, while eversion is going to be away from the middle segment of the body. So this is going to be toward the lateral side. It's really rather difficult to talk about the movement without really being face to face, because I can show you. But anyway, this is an online course, so we still have to talk about all these movements. All right. So now, a very important piece of this chapter. How is the skeletal system growing? By which mechanism is the bone forming? From what? How do we repair the bone? So now we are going to go to the full extent of the bone cells. We are going to talk about the different kind of bone cells that are involved in bone, in ossification, bone formation, in bone remodeling, in bone repair. All right. Okay. So the first cell we are going to talk about is the osteoblast. The osteoblasts are these cells which job is to convert hyaline cartilage into bone, right? Osteoblasts, they do ossification. Ossification, all right? Ossification. That's what osteoblasts do. That's their job. Then you have the osteoclast. The osteoclast are bone cells that do the opposite of ossification. They eat away the bone, right? They're doing bone absorption, okay? So in other words, this bone cells eat away the bone, right? Now, the other bone cell I'm going to address is the osteocytes. Osteocytes are bone cells that are trapped in a hard matrix. In other words, during the formation of the bone, the osteoblast is going to form the bone. Then the osteoblast, as it forms the bone, it's going to be surrounded with a tough, solid matrix. That tough, solid matrix do not allow an easy circulation of nutrients and waste. As consequence of that, when the bone is completely formed, the osteoblast gets trapped. It gets trapped, and as it gets trapped, the metabolic activity of the osteoblast is going to go down. The osteoblast doesn't die, but the metabolic activity, because of how the nutrients are becoming scarce, and also as it is difficult to get rid of the waste, the only solution is to decrease the level of metabolic activity. And as this osteoblast decrease tremendously their level of metabolic activity, we don't call them osteoblasts anymore. We call them osteocytes. They are still alive, they are still active, but their level of activity is extremely reduced. All right. Then, the last cell I'm going to address are chondrocytes. Chondrocytes, okay. There is a typo, chondrocytes. Chondrocyte. Now, the chondrocytes are not bone cells. These are cartilage cells. But remember that bone formation occurs out of hyaline cartilage, right? Therefore, before the formation of the bone, you have chondrocytes present in there, okay? So please correct this. This is chondrocyte, all right? These are cartilage cells. All right. In the bone development is also called ossification, right? The making up of the bone, okay? Now, what are the mechanisms of ossification? You have two of them. One, it's what we call intramembranous ossification. Intra means inside, membranous, membrane, inside the membrane. So imagine that you have one membrane and two membrane, right? So you have two. In between these two membrane, you're going to have ossification that is going to happen. This is membranous ossification. This type of ossification is important for flat bones. Think, for instance, of the bones that make up the cranium, right? The parietal bone, for instance, the temporal bones, the occipital bone, they are all flat bones, right? These bones are all made via intramembranous ossification, okay? Then you do have the endochondral ossification. Endo means inside. Chondrial, it's basically the cartilage, specifically hyaline cartilage, right? So out of the hyaline cartilage, ossification is going to occur, right? So here, the cartilage is going to be progressively replaced by the bone. This is typically the type of ossification that happens in long bones, all long bones regardless, right? Whether you're talking about the humerus, you're talking about the femur, you're talking about the ulna, you're talking about the radius, the fibula, right? The tibia, right? So all these long bones and many other long bones are formed through the process of endochondral ossification. All right. So, and again, it's endochondral, not endochondrial. So this I doesn't exist, okay? This I doesn't exist. I'm sorry, that's a typo. Endochondral ossification. Chondral, no, I made a mistake again. Endochondral, there we go, ossification. This is it. All right, okay, so that's what I want you to remember. All right, so now, endochondral ossification. If you consider a fetus that is growing, the skeleton of a fetus, it's nothing but hyaline cartilage throughout. Okay, all the skeletal system of a fetus, it's first of all start with cartilage, right? Hyaline cartilage. That hyaline cartilage is going to be calcified. In other words, you're going to have a deposition of calcium ions among the collagen fibers and the elastic fibers. Remember, calcium, when many calcium come together, many salts of calcium come together, they end up forming something that look like a rock, right? Just like it is done in nature, the same thing happens in our body. The calcium combines with other ions, including phosphate, and as they combine, they form a hard structure. And that hard structure is the bone, right? So we have some bone that start forming, right, out of this. So first of all, you have a model that is 100% cartilaginous, and then you are going to have what we call a primary ossification center. The primary ossification center, it's going to happen right in here, right? So what happens is that the chondrocytes are going to die off and be replaced by the osteoblast. This osteoblast are going to cause the formation of a compact bone in this primary ossification site. All right? So now, remember that the tissue needs to live. For this tissue to live, you need blood vessels. As the bone starts forming, you now have blood vessels that are going to come and develop in the primary ossification site. Okay? That primary ossification center, it's where the osteoblast will now start replacing the hyaline cartilage with the bone, right? And you have that the hyaline cartilage get formed, but also some part of the newly formed bone will have to be eaten away. It is eaten away by cells called osteoblast, so that some part of the area where the bone was, the bone is going to go away. Okay? So this is what you see right here. Okay? So the bone is being eaten away so that the medullary cavity can develop. The osteoclasts are the one that cause the development of the medullary cavity in the shaft of the long bone. As this is happening, and concomitantly, you have a secondary ossification center that develops. This secondary ossification center develops at the extremity of long bones. Okay? So now you're going to have a secondary ossification center where osteoblasts are going to replace hyaline cartilage with the bone, right? And again, osteocytes are the one that are going to replace the hyaline cartilage at the extremity of long bone here with the bone, right? Now, because of the nourishment that is needed, you have some blood vessels that are going to develop in these ossification centers. Now, as we have now two ossification centers, so you have one, you have two, in between you have an area where ossification will keep happening as an individual grows. This is really where the bone is going to grow from, right? So that the bone is going to grow this way and this way, causing the limbs to grow in length, right? Now, with that being said, to avoid the bones to rub against each other in articulation, there is a certain cartilage that is going to be retained. That is the articular cartilage that is made up of hyaline cartilage. But we have here the plate that allows the growth, what we call the epiphyseal growth plate, the epiphyseal growth plate. That epiphyseal growth plate is what allows the long bones to keep growing. When that epiphyseal growth plate is replaced by bone, at that point, there is no more growth. All right. So, we have the medullary cavity right here. And that medullary cavity, it's basically the bone that is eaten away, right? The medullary cavity is going to be a place where some fat tissue is going to be stored, right? Okay. And here, you're going to have some spongy bone. Here we have compact bone, right? Here you have the epiphyseal plate where growth is happening. And when we look at where growth is happening, what do we see specifically? We see the ossification zone. The ossification zone, this is where the bone is forming, right? Then we have the degenerating zone. The degenerating zone is where the hyaline cartilage is being broken down and replaced by the bone. Then we have the proliferating zone. The proliferating zone, it's this area where the cartilage is being produced. That production is necessary to allow an individual to grow. Then we have a resting zone. That resting zone is where not much activity is happening with the cartilage, right? The hyaline cartilage, I mean. And then we have the epiphysis, right? So the area of growth of the bone, it's going to be an area where bunch of activity is happening, right? That activity is necessary to actually allow growth to happen in an individual. All right. So the endochondral ossification, which I just described earlier, is going to start with a cartilage model, right? So we're going to have some chondrocytes that are going to produce hyaline cartilage, right, in the shape of the future bone. Then you are going to have the bone collar. The bone collar, this is where the osteoblasts start secreting the bone matrix, right, and the compact bone start forming. Then we have the primary ossification center. Here, the osteoblasts are going to get inside and start depositing the bone, right? Blood cells are going to develop, right? And these blood cells are bringing some nutrients. And the bone, the first bone that forms, it's a spongy bone, right? And that spongy bone is going to be remodeled later on. Then we have the medullary cavity. The medullary cavity develops out of the modeling of the spongy bone, right? Now, we're going to have the medullary cavity, which there the osteoclasts are eating away the bones, right? We have a secondary ossification site you have secondary ossification sites that are going to develop, right? In the extremity of long bones, so the epiphysis, right? And the osteoclasts are going to eat away whatever they need to eat, right? And eventually, in the medullary cavity, you have some cells that are going to form fat tissue in there. And then we're going to have the epiphyseal plate where growth is going to be actively happening. Now, we talked about the growth of the bone. What controls the growth of the bones? This is when we are going to talk about hormones and salts. Now, first up, vitamin D. Vitamin D, it's actually going to be converted to a hormone that is essential for the absorption of calcium in the intestine. Now, there are some hormones that we are going to address here. One is the growth hormone. The growth hormone, or GH, is going to stimulate the activity of osteoblast, right, in the epiphyseal plates. This is going to actively cause bone formation. But in addition to the growth hormones, you are also going to have the sex hormones, including testosterone, right? That is going to cause the growth of people during at a certain stage of the life, right? We have a huge amount of testosterone that is released. That amount of testosterone is going to go toward the development of bones, in addition to other things that that testosterone is doing in the body, right? There are some other hormones. You have the thyroid hormones and the parathyroid hormones, right? We are going to address that at some point. So, in the bone renewal is going to involve remodeling of the bone. It's going to involve activity of osteoblast and activity of osteoclast. Now, these two types of cells are going to be controlled tightly by two hormones. You have the thyroid hormone and the parathyroid hormone. The thyroid hormone and the parathyroid hormone, their job is to control the amount of calcium in the blood. As they control the amount of calcium in the blood, they also work on osteoblast and osteoclast, right? Osteoblasts are going to be activated when there is a lot of calcium in the blood, so that they're going to store that calcium, they're going to deposit that calcium as part of the bone formation, right? While osteoblasts, right, are going to be activated when there is a low amount of calcium in the blood. In other words, osteoclasts are going to eat away the blood, breaking down the bone, releasing calcium ion. This calcium ion is actually going to go in circulation for many purposes. But as this calcium is released, the bones become fragile, right? But that's another story. We are going to address that later. Let me talk about remodeling. So, remodeling allows us to respond to stresses. For instance, when we exercise, that's a stress. When we are walking, running, that's a stress. But also, when we are sitting around, when we have a sedentary life, right? That's another kind of stress, okay? But anyway, so you have hormones that are very much involved in regulating the amount of calcium in the blood. The parathyroid hormone PTH is going to increase the amount of calcium in the blood, while the thyroid hormone, or calcitonin, right, is going to decrease the amount of calcium in the blood. Now, here is what I want you to remember. Decrease in the amount of calcium in the blood means ossification or muscle contraction, all right? Because calcium is stored either in the muscle cells or in the bones, okay? While parathyroid hormone is actually going to work toward releasing calcium in the blood. I already mentioned that, but it doesn't hurt to repeat. All right. So we notice that the diameter of the bones is going to change as we age, as we grow old in age. So from infant to child to adult, the diameter of the bone is going to increase, right? The density of the bone, it's also going to increase, right? The density of the bone, so how thick and condensed the tissue, the compact tissue is in that bone, right? Okay, so please remember that. So as we grow, we have to absorb calcium and other ions, including magnesium, phosphorus, right? Phosphate ions, right? All right. Now, not everything is always perfect in our system, right? As we grow old, we lose some abilities, including the ability to store calcium in an easy way. We don't absorb calcium from our diet well anymore, which means that we are going to need more vitamin D as we grow old, right? That's why most of the time, elderly people are going to receive supplements of vitamin D, because vitamin D is very important for the absorption of calcium. Now, osteoporosis, it's a condition where bones become weak, right? Where the compact bone is progressively converted into porous bone, right? Or spongy bone, right? The bones becomes very weak. That's why we need to exercise on a regular basis. And this process of loss of bone really happens, usually starts in the 40s. Okay? Now, the risk factor of developing osteoporosis only increase with age, 1. Also with gender, 2, right? Osteoporosis is much more common in female than in males because of osteoporosis. Because of menopause. But you also have what we call drop in the level of testosterone in males that also cause a fragilization of bones, right? So not only males undergo menopause, but not only female, undergo menopause, male also experience the equivalent of menopause, all right? So other things, lifestyle, what you eat, what you drink can affect extensively your chances of developing osteoporosis, right? Having a diet that is poor in calcium, it basically can lead you to develop osteoporosis. And because of osteoporosis, we become prone to fractures and eventually complications, right? We can solve this by taking additional, by taking food supplement, bringing us calcium, taking some hormones like testosterone, right? Change your lifestyle, exercising, for instance, or using some drugs, right, that can compensate. Then, sometimes when we do activities, we can actually break our bones. When that happens, what is the process by which the bones are repaired? Well, whenever you have a rupture of a long bone, first and foremost, you're going to have an hematoma that forms. Okay? That hematoma forms within 6 to 8 hours of the fracture. Okay? That hematoma is basically going to consist of a big blood clot, right, that form in the area where the fracture occurred. Now, this hematoma is going to be progressively replaced by some cartilaginous tissue. That cartilaginous tissue is called fibrocartilaginous callus. Now, that fibrocartilaginous callus, it's basically, again, it's cartilage, right? That cartilage was made possible by chondrocytes, right? These chondrocytes are going to be progressively be replaced by osteoblasts. So osteoblasts are going to come and replace this chondroblast and convert cartilage into fibrocartilage into bone, right? Now, the fibrocartilaginous callus is going to last about 3 weeks. This is going to be progressively be replaced by the bony callus. That bony callus, it's actually when the cartilaginous callus is going to be replaced by the bone, right? Now, this lasts about 3 to 4 months, but really it can last longer. And you have a fine-tuning of the bone that was newly replaced, right? That is going to eat away the excess bone, right? Which means that you need the action of osteoclast here, right? To eat away the excess bone and to actually trim the bone in such a way that it looks close to what it was before. So here, our last slide is showing you the different stages of bone repair wherever there is a fracture. So you have the formation of hematoma right here, right? Then the hematoma is replaced by the fibrocartilaginous callus, right? Which is nothing but the fibrocartilage. That fibrocartilage is going to be followed by the development of blood vessels that will start nourishing that tissue, and eventually this fibrocartilaginous callus is going to be replaced by the bony callus. That bony callus actually is going to be progressively eaten away so that it forms the perfect, the bone becomes close to what it was before. Notice the development of, again here, the medullary cavity, right? The medullary cavity is restored. This is made possible because of the remodeling. So we have a young man here with a cast. So this is basically what we needed to cover in this chapter. Thank you for your attention and take care.